For centuries, an extraordinary war has raged across the world's oceans, above and below the waves.
You could kill hundreds of people with one broadside. These were extremely powerful war machines.
Shipbuilders designed bigger and faster vessels to outwit and crush their opponents.
That nation that has the most powerful battleship fleet can destroy the enemy's battleship fleet and therefore control the seas. And if you control the seas, you control the world.
They carried terrifying weapons.
This was going to be the first time that somebody had fired a torpedo in anger since World War II. They needed to get it right.
But ships have also liberated and rescued thousands.
You could think of Gerda III as basically a lifeboat for persons hunted by the Nazis.
And inspired men and women to acts of incredible bravery.
I will take you there now. To your cannons, to your death. We will sink before surrender.
These vessels and their crews have shaped world history.
As the commanding officer of a missile-carrying submarine, I was directly responsible for helping to prevent World War III.
This time, we venture to the heart of naval combat zones. Not to fight, but to rescue.
These were heroes saving lives, taking a stand against evil.
This is a story of unique vessels and their dedicated crews.
They go down below and they find the cargo of 705 captive Africans on board.
For 2 centuries, the horrors of war have grown. But so too have the many tales of those that came to save.
When you're in a war like that, everybody does what they have to do. And I was fortunate in bringing the boys to a safer place.
From the first great warships to the age of nuclear weapons, our greatest combat ships tell a story, not just of technology, but of human history too. Amidst the skyscrapers of modern Baltimore is just such a vessel. She represents the end of a maritime era, but also the time when warships began to save lives. The USS Constellation. As the Constellation unfurled her sails for the first time in 1854, the world was already turning to engine power. She was the last US Navy ship to rely totally on wind.
It's an arms race, just like today. So everybody's trying to make sure they have the newest, best things. And so that's why the Navy stopped with all sail.
But despite being outclassed by almost every warship of her era, Constellation has gone down in history as a ship that saved hundreds of people from a terrible fate. In the early 1800s, the United States was under pressure to put a stop to the vast numbers of African slaves entering the country. Following the lead of Great Britain, the US agreed to abolish the lucrative trade.
The Americans outlaw the Atlantic slave trade in 1808. And in 1820, it's declared an act of piracy, punishable by death. So by the 1820s, it's illegal for American sailors to engage in the trade as well.
Whilst 4 million slaves remained captive on United States soil, the US Navy was given the job of ensuring that number didn't grow. A small fleet, known as the Africa Squadron, was formed to hunt down slave ships leaving Africa, bound for Cuba and South America.
When you have a profit margin of 1,000%, even if it's illegal, people are going to do it.
In September 1860, the Constellation was patrolling close to the Congo River Delta. For weeks, there had been no sign of slave ships. Then on the afternoon of the 25th, one of Constellation's lookouts spotted a sail on the horizon.
She's in a suspicious area where we know there's some trouble going on. Constellation is a very fast ship. We fire a warning shot that says, "Stop your ship," and the ship doesn't stop. Keeps on going, puts up more sail, and starts to run. So now we know something's up.
Constellation gains on the fleeing vessel. As it does, it becomes clear what cargo the mystery ship is carrying.
She starts by throwing over jetsam and flotsam into the water, trying to lighten the ship to make it go a little faster. Then they employ a tactic where they start to unload some of their more important cargo, the human cargo. The hope is that the Constellation, given that its mission is to save those people, will stop to rescue people out of the water.
Faced with a horrendous decision, the Constellation pursues the slave ship. It fires shots through its rigging to force a surrender. The ship is identified as an American vessel named the Cora. A boarding party from the Constellation is sent across.
They go down below, and you open the hatch, and you're immediately hit with the stench and the misery of human squalor. And they find the cargo of 705 captive Africans on board.
The crew of the Constellation were horrified by what they saw. One man later wrote, "The scene which here presented itself to my eye baffles description. It was a dreadful sight." The captain and crew of the Cora were arrested, transferred to the Constellation, and taken back to the United States to be tried. But justice was not done.
All of them are acquitted. No consequences are ever, as far as we know, given to that crew. They all got off.
No longer destined for a slave's life in South America, 705 Africans were taken to the US Protectorate of Liberia and were set free. Constellation's rescue of the slaves earned her a moment of glory, and within a few years, the barbaric trade of the slave ships had ceased. More and more, navies would come to rely on rescue ships, not for slaves, but for their own men. The idea was nothing new. Even HMS Victory's famous gun decks were at one point used to care for the sick and the wounded. But as battles became bloodier and weapons ever more terrifying, there was a need for dedicated vessels to rescue, care, and transport the injured. The 20th century was the age of the hospital ship. With tens of thousands of troops fighting on the Western Front, it was the British who developed a new category of combat ship during the First World War. From the horrors of the trenches, the wounded would be rushed away by light railway, then by ambulance train, and finally carried across the Channel by dedicated hospital ships back to England.
We're crossing here to Southampton, and of course this was the busiest route for hospital ships from the Western Front. It wasn't a particularly long journey, but it could be rough and it could be dangerous. We know that 1.2 million patients were received at Southampton. That's 1.2 million patients in wards that needed to be kept clean, that needed to be offloaded as easily and as painlessly as possible, and then sent on to the right hospitals.
Weary of the bleak news from the Western Front, the British public loved to hear instead of those who had saved troops and brought them home safely. In 1917, King George V paid tribute to the medical staff on the former P&O liner Placid.
Like all the medical institutions in France and coming back to Britain, none of it could have been done without hundreds of thousands of nurses who volunteered to go out and serve. Nurses prepared really well, and particularly nurses who were going to be on hospital ships. They took extensive life-saving courses, and most of them learned how to row, particularly row a very large, heavy boat that would be full of their patients.
In theory, the nurses and their patients were protected by international law. The Geneva Convention stipulated that hospital ships should be immune from attack if they followed certain rules.
One was that they should not be carrying munitions, they should not be obstructing the actions of an enemy at all, and they should be clearly marked. And the clear marking involved being painted white, having a broad green stripe along the hull, and having clear red crosses marked on them, and being lit at night. And if hospital ships conformed to those rules, they were meant to be immune from attack.
But German U-boat captains had other ideas.
About 24 hospital ships were sunk in the First World War. Quite a lot of them were sunk by hitting mines, which isn't proof of deliberate target selection. But also, quite a lot of them, about half, were torpedoed, and one can only assume it to be deliberate. The Germans got it into their heads that the British were using hospital ships for warlike purposes. They alleged the British were using them as troop ships, which they weren't. And so they conducted a U-boat campaign.
Nurses on board the ships making the dash across the channel adapted to the U-boat threat.
It was easier to keep your life jacket on all the time, so on top of their proper nurse's uniform, starched nurse's uniform, the long skirt and the boots and the apron, they put a life jacket and probably a coat because it was cold. They did all their nursing and they did it in life jackets.
One nurse in particular knew all about the dangers at sea. Having survived the most famous of all maritime disasters, she found history repeating as she served on the largest hospital ship of the Great War.
I turned around and, to my horror, saw Britannic's huge propellers churning and mincing everything near them. Men, boats, everything were just one ghastly whirl.
The 15th of April 1912 is a date that lives in infamy in maritime history. Just 5 days earlier, the mighty RMS Titanic had set sail on her maiden voyage. A voyage she would never complete. At Titanic shipyard in Belfast, construction of a new ship stopped abruptly. This was to be Titanic's sister ship, the Britannic.
What we're actually looking down us is the slipways of Titanic and Britannic. Britannic was built over on the left-hand side.
Britannic's owners, the White Star Line, believed their ship to be as perfect a specimen of man's creative power as it is possible to conceive.
The height of this building is the same height as Britannic, from keel to boat deck. How did Britannic get into Belfast Lock? They used 23 tons of oil, grease and soap, and they shoved them in. Empty shells weighing over 23,000 tons. As the shipyard workers used to call it, we built them up and shoved them out.
But 5 months after Britannic's launch, in July 1914, the First World War broke out. The luxury world of ocean liners was quickly forgotten. Britannic was abandoned and left unfinished at Harland and Wolff shipyard. But then in April 1915, the Allies attacked Turkey's Gallipoli Peninsula. They hoped it would force the Turks out of the war, but they'd underestimated the vast amount of men and supplies that would be needed in the Eastern Mediterranean. The solution lay in huge pre-war liners. Mauritania and the White Star Line's Olympic became troop ships. But to bring the casualties home, they would need a massive hospital ship. One vessel seemed to fit the bill. The half-finished Britannic.
Much of the ship was complete. There is documented evidence of a lot of nice cabins, a lot of very plush dining rooms, all completed and ready for service. Because some of these cabins hadn't been put in, there were large open spaces in the ship, which oddly enough made her ideal as a hospital ship because they gave her much larger wards, much easier to oversee.
On the 22nd of December 1915, His Majesty's hospital ship Britannic, now painted white, sailed from Liverpool on her maiden voyage, the first of many trips to rescue the sick and wounded of the Gallipoli campaign. Learning the lessons of Titanic, the new ship had twice as many lifeboats.
Internally, they were quite different. Britannic had a double skin alongside the boiler rooms and the engine room. They had higher and stronger bulkheads. The whole idea was that had Britannic hit the iceberg which sank the Titanic, she would have survived the disaster.
On the 21st of November 1916, 9 months after her first voyage, Britannic was sailing eastwards off the coast of Greece. On board were almost 400 medical staff. Britannic entered the Kier Channel, but 3 weeks earlier, German U-boat U-73 had made the same journey. The U-boat's commander, Gustav Sees, had left behind a trail of deadly mines.
Capitan Lieutenant Sees had a very sort of wily ploy of laying his mines deep. That way he got a larger vessel. He didn't go for small destroyers or small little fishing boats. He wanted to get a big ship. That could have been a battleship, it could have been a trooper, it could have been a hospital ship. He got a hospital ship.
The 21st of November was a typical Sunday morning on board.
Up in the lounge, the medical staff were sitting down having their breakfast. Down below, the firemen and the stokers, trimmers, they were all changing their posts. Everything was completely and utterly normal. Then suddenly, 12 minutes past 8, a huge bang on the starboard side, followed by a violent shudder.
On board that morning was 28-year-old nurse Violet Jessup. For her, the scenario was painfully familiar. 4 years earlier, she had been a stewardess on Titanic when it struck the infamous iceberg.
As one man, the whole saloon rose from their seats. Doctors and nurses vanished to their posts in a trice. The pantry, where I stood, holding a teapot in one hand and a pat of butter in the other, was cleared too as men dropped what they were doing. In seconds, not a soul was to be seen.
Down below in the boiler rooms, particularly 5 and 6, where the water was rushing in, the stokers and the trimmers were fighting for their lives already, trying to get up the stairways before they were completely overwhelmed by the water.
The mine had ripped into 2 watertight compartments. The Britannic should have coped, but some of the watertight doors had failed. Seawater was now flooding through the ship. The Britannic was sinking faster than the Titanic. Nurses, medics and crew alike clambered aboard the lifeboats. But as Violet Jessup's boat reached the sea, her companions almost immediately jumped overboard. She soon found out why.
I turned around to see the reason for this exodus and, to my horror, saw Britannic's huge propellers churning and mincing everything near them. Men, boats, everything were just one ghastly whirl.
As the lifeboat hit the water, it couldn't get away from the side of the ship, moving through the water. It bumped along the side of the ship, practically 2/3 of the length of the ship, and was dragged into this huge turning propeller, 23-foot diameter.
In another moment, I would be under those glittering, relentless blades, unless I looked at the equally inexorable sea and, for a fraction of a second, hesitated, for I've always been afraid of water.
She jumped. She didn't manage to get clear. She was pulled down by the force of the propeller.
I felt myself rising, and my head came into violent contact with something solid, something that prevented me from reaching the surface. Then again, there was another terrific crash above me, and something very solid struck the back of my head, a resounding blow. But happily, on that part where my plentiful hair was thickest.
Violet fought her way to the surface, only to face a scene of horror. 30 people had been killed by the propellers. Just after 9 a.m, the Britannic rolled onto its starboard side before plunging bow first to the seabed. the largest ship lost in the First World War, had sunk in just 55 minutes. Violet and the other survivors were rescued by the Royal Navy. The wreck of the Britannic lies 400 feet down, at the bottom of the Keir Channel. And whilst Titanic is breaking up on the Atlantic seabed, her sister ship is in remarkably good condition.
If you compare the wreck of the Titanic with the wreck of the Britannic, they are just completely and utterly different. Titanic is in two main sections, where the whole middle third of the ship is gone in fragments on the seabed. Britannic is almost completely intact.
The massive propellers that caused such carnage are still in place. Even the captain's bath with its 4 taps is visible.
I've been watching that wreck now for something like 20 years. I don't think it's changed in all that time. She is incredibly stable, and I think will be around for a good while yet.
Despite the loss of many hospital ships, these vessels proved themselves a vital part of the First World War effort. By its end, there were 77 in service. In 1939, war returned, and so too did these important vessels.
I think if you took a crew from a First World War hospital ship and put them on a Second World War hospital ship, they'd really recognise everything that they found there. They'd be jealous of the speed, but the spaces are the same. And what both of them would recognise is this unseen threat from submarines. Living with that fear is something that only hospital ship crews really understood. How you did that day after day and voyage after voyage is something that we must never underestimate. It's a truly remarkable part of their service.
In 1945, Lois Langens was just 21 when she served as a nurse on an American hospital ship. She and her colleagues collected injured soldiers from the ports of Cherbourg and Liverpool, caring for them across the Atlantic to bring them home to the United States.
It was toward the end of the war, so they were all through going back into battle. And when they finally got on board a hospital ship, it was like a real, take a big breath, I'm off the land, I'm headed home.
20 years on from the First World War, there was now greater awareness of injuries both seen and unseen.
For us nurses, part of it was trying to understand. Some of the boys didn't want to talk about anything. Some wanted to talk and get it off their mind. And our aim was to do the best we could to keep them mobile, interested in going home and not going back over all of the bad experiences. It really made you feel that you needed to pay attention to these kids and they needed help. It was a time, a period in my life that's very special. When you're in a war like that, everybody does what they have to do. You don't sit home and wonder, you do it. I was fortunate in bringing the boys to a safer place.
But not all World War II rescue ships made it home. One of the biggest rescue operations mounted by the British became the country's greatest maritime disaster.
It was felt that this terrible tragedy would have such an effect on national morale that it needed to be kept secret. And so it was.
Amongst the horrors of World War II, there are many stories of bravery and heroism. Few, though, are as famous as the miracle of Dunkirk. The mass evacuation of British and French troops, whilst under attack from the Germans in 1940, has entered folklore. By contrast, a few weeks later, another evacuation took place from the French coast. But it's rarely spoken of. And yet, it led to the greatest maritime loss of life the world had ever known. Despite Dunkirk, 150,000 British troops and civilians were still trapped in France. They were told to make their way to a string of ports from Cherbourg in the north to Saint-Jean-de-Luz in the south. Meanwhile, the British assembled another armada of rescue ships. They prepared for Operation Ariel. Waiting to be saved was 26-year-old Royal Engineer Walter Hurst. His unit had been building an airfield near Nantes.
My grandfather volunteered because he wanted to go back to France to finish the job that his father had begun in World War I. And all of a sudden, he's now being basically chased out of France. In June, they started to realise there was something going on. The RAF ground crew suddenly disappeared. They'd left by trucks. There was no communication between the different elements of the British forces, and it was a real shock.
Walter and thousands of other troops made their way by truck to the port of Saint-Nazaire. They arrived on June 16, 1940.
When the company, my grandfather's company, arrived in Saint-Nazaire, they discovered that there was tens of thousands of troops waiting for embarkation. So they waited overnight in gangways. There wasn't any accommodation, they just slept rough. And there was a very heavy air raid that night by the Germans. And that was their first sense of panic, first sense that there was something going wrong with the entire operation.
Waiting offshore were about 30 rescue ships. One of them was a former luxury liner, which had been turned into a troop ship, the HMT Lancastria.
The Lancastria was a Cunard ship, and her main trade was with American tourists. Initially, the Lancastria was named the Titanic, but in 1924, the company decided to change the name because the American passengers had difficulty pronouncing the name Titanic. And it's always said by mariners that changing the name of a ship brings bad luck, and so it was to prove for the Lancastria.
Lancastria was really ordered by the Admiralty to evacuate from Saint-Nazaire as many British people as she could without regard to her formal passenger carrying capacity.
Unlike Dunkirk, the German army was too far away to launch an attack from land. Instead, the great threat at Saint-Nazaire came from the air. On the morning of the 17th of June, hundreds of soldiers and civilians broke their cover, boarding small boats that took them out to the rescue ships. Walter Hurst and his unit were taken to the giant Lancastria, commanded by Captain Rudolf Sharp.
And when she arrived, the French pilot came out and addressed the captain, Captain Sharp, and said, do you realise, sir, you're putting your neck in the noose by being here? But they had no other alternative.
Walter Hurst was shocked by the numbers already on board the liner.
My grandfather's best friend happened to see the chief purser, and he stopped him. He says, you're looking really worried. He says, well, you would be really worried. With upwards of 6,000, probably 7,000 or 8,000 aboard, we don't have enough life-saving equipment for them if something goes wrong.
The exhausted troops made themselves at home. They ate breakfast, served by white-jacketed stewards, in the Lancastria's dining saloon. There was a moment to take a bath or a nap in one of the cabins. 800 RAF men were led down into a large hold where mattresses had been laid out for them. But then came what everyone dreaded.
The klaxons on the Lancastria sounded. German aircraft began an attack and initially concentrated their attack on the SS Oronsay, which was lying roughly a mile from the Lancastria's position.
The Oronsay's bridge took a direct hit. Several men were killed, but she remained afloat. But the German planes weren't finished.
The sirens on the Lancastria sounded again, signalling a second attack. And quickly after that, a German bomber, a Junkers 88, appeared low and heading from bow to stern across the Lancastria and dropped 4 500-kilogram bombs which struck the ship in rapid succession.
The 800 RAF men in the hold were killed instantly. The Lancastria started to shudder, making a noise that sounded to Captain Sharp like a wounded animal.
It would have been an indescribable horror being inside that ship. There would have been fires, there would be smoke. Very few people would have known the way out. It really doesn't bear thinking about the sheer panic and chaos of what would have happened inside that ship.
One of the survivors who I spoke to said that when he was in the water, he could see men desperately, who were trapped below decks, desperately trying to get out through the porthole windows. And he said it was just, you could see 2 or 3 men in front of each other, and then behind them, fire. And that image stayed with them, and they weren't getting out. These men were trapped, they were going to the bottom.
As the Lancastria began to capsize, men, women and children scrambled onto the turning hull. Some began singing, "Roll Out the Barrel," and "They'll Always Be in England." But their songs were soon drowned out as the planes returned.
Not content with sinking what was obviously a very large British troopship, the Luftwaffe came back and began strafing the men in the water, and also trying to drop incendiary flares to light the oil which was escaping from the Lancastria. And it was a kind of macabre spectacle, these men sinking. And all the time the Germans were continuing the attack. All around there was men struggling, drowning.
By that point, Walter Hurst was in the water too. He was approached by another man in a state of total panic.
Perhaps he thought my granddad was dead because he was trying to stay as still as possible. He was covered in oil and he was trying to wrestle the life jacket from him. And a battle broke out between the two of them. And eventually the madman, because that's all he could be, he was out of his mind as you would be, disappeared below my grandfather. And I think that affected him deeply.
The Lancastria sank in just 20 minutes. Amidst the chaos of the evacuation, the true death toll has never been confirmed. But at least 3,000 lost their lives. It may have been almost double that. But almost 2,500 did survive. Walter Hurst was picked up by a French fishing boat and was eventually returned to Plymouth for a traumatic homecoming.
And as they walked off the gangplank, there was a Royal Marines band playing to welcome the men back, and they were playing Roll Out the Barrel. And for my granddad, for many of the other survivors, they couldn't stand, they couldn't tolerate that song after it because they associated it with this horror aboard the Lancastria.
The liner that started life as a vessel for rich American holidaymakers ended it with an unenviable record. The largest single loss of life in British maritime history. Back home, Prime Minister Winston Churchill turned to damage limitation. He knew news of the disaster would have a devastating effect on the British public. Walter Hurst and his fellow survivors were forbidden to speak of it.
The country was on a kind of strange sort of high after Dunkirk, after we'd got the main British Army back. And it was felt that this terrible tragedy would have such an effect on national morale that it needed to be kept secret. And so it was.
The sinking of the rescue ship Lancastria is still rarely spoken of in Britain. But in Saint-Nazaire, there is a simple seafront memorial.
For the survivors, one of the hardest aspects was everyone talks about the Titanic, everyone talks about the Lusitania, yet the Lancastria claimed more lives than those two disasters combined. And that's hurtful. I mean, they felt that the sacrifice that their colleagues had made was not acknowledged. It was forgotten, and it was almost like an embarrassment to them.
Amidst the great losses of the Second World War, there were rescues that worked. Many because they went unnoticed. One small ship, a civilian crew, and a determination to save others.
These were heroes saving lives. These are people who should never be forgotten.
"1940 was a tumultuous year in the history of Europe. In just 3 months, the German army swept through Holland, Belgium, Luxembourg and France. On April the 9th, Denmark was Hitler's target. The country surrendered in just 6 hours. But whilst resisting the German army was futile, Denmark took a firm stand against one of Hitler's key operations.
They insisted, we're going to keep your religious persecution out. We're not going to have your war against the Jews enter Danish soil.
The country was operating as a German protectorate, but still able to exert influence when attention turned to Denmark's 8,000 Jews.
And so, for a period of years, they were able to keep their Jewish population safe while Jews in every other occupied country were being rounded up.
But at the end of September 1943, word leaked that a mass deportation of Jews would take place in just 3 days. The reaction was remarkable. The Danish people sprung into action.
Within that 72-hour period, pretty much the entire Jewish population of Denmark was not just warned, but sheltered, given temporary hiding.
Hitler was furious. He sent Adolf Eichmann, a key enforcer of the Jewish Holocaust, to hunt down Denmark's Jews and end this Nazi humiliation. In a country as small and as isolated as Denmark, this should have been easy. But there was one place where Denmark's Jews might be able to escape to: neutral Sweden.
It was the only unoccupied land within about 400 or so miles, and it was so tantalizingly close you could see it.
But the only way to flee to Sweden was by boat. Once again, the Danish people responded.
Within a matter of a day or two, a rescue fleet began to take form, and ultimately about 300 boats participated.
The first attempts to smuggle Jews out of Denmark were a disaster. Boats were intercepted by the Gestapo. Their passengers and crew were imprisoned. But one young woman believed she could make a difference. Henny Sinding was just 19 in 1943. There are no known photos of her. But in just a few months, she helped dozens and dozens of Danish Jews escape the Nazis. She took her father's small working boat in Copenhagen and turned it into the most unlikely rescue ship of the Second World War. Its unassuming name was Gerda 3. Henny Sinding's father used Gerda 3 to carry supplies to a lighthouse. But for 3 years, she'd also been used to smuggle resistance fighters in and out of Denmark.
Henny could not abide the notion that the Nazis would interfere with people she considered simply fellow Danes, which is how the country regarded the Jewish population. An attack on them was an attack on the Danes, and they felt they needed to do anything.
Henny's escape method was simple enough. Use Gerda 3's regular journeys out to the lighthouse as cover for transporting Jews to Sweden. The challenge was getting those people to Gerda 3 in the first place.
Henny would start each day being given a list of names of people to meet, places to meet them, all of which had to be memorized. You couldn't have any of this in writing. And then at 1 a.m. each day, before the boat's next sailing, she would go to the safe houses, escort people along the street to the warehouse where Nazi sentries would march back and forth, and wait for gaps in their crossings during which they could run people one at a time, cross the quay, onto Gerda, and down into the cargo hold. You could think of Gerda 3 as basically a lifeboat for persons hunted by the Nazis.
About 20 people would be squeezed in amongst the cargo.
A small space, as you can see, about 10 by 12 feet, never more than 4.5 feet high to these beams. The most that they ever attempted to fit in was about 15 people. And you could envision them pretty much as far out as they could get, probably pressed pretty much against the whole planks.
But before Gerda 3 could leave Copenhagen, she would be inspected by armed soldiers. It was the key moment for those hiding below.
Right above this, for some period of time, you'd have those Nazi sentries, their boots how many inches above the heads of the refugees? Not many. And they'd be chatting with the crew, talking about the weather, exchanging pleasantries. It must have been a tremendous relief when the engine was turned on. If you're sitting next to it or near it as we are now, you hear kind of a pop, 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 almost more like a rapid heartbeat than the drone of a diesel. And you can just imagine how every one of those pops, to them would be just signify another foot or 2 feet perhaps further from the Nazis, closer to salvation on the Swedish shore.
The autumn seas were often rough. Conditions were grim.
You think of the people over the course of the war who were sitting in this space or along this plank or the planks over there, braced against the movement of the boat. And here they would be in the darkness. No ports, no overhead lights. This was never envisioned to be a place where people would travel.
Despite German patrols and hostile weather, it's believed that in the last months of 1943, Henny Sinding and Gerda's crew carried 300 Jews to safety.
They were incredibly brave people, and they had this great moral compass. And as a whole, it was phenomenally successful. About 94% of Denmark's Jewish population was brought to safety. By latest best count, 7,742 Jews, another 686 loved ones of other religions. There was just no parallel to that anywhere else in the occupied world.
Today, Gerda 3 can be found across the Atlantic, owned by the New York Museum of Jewish Heritage. A tribute to the brave men and women who helped so many Danish Jews escape the Nazis.
These were heroes saving lives, taking a stand against evil. And you look around here and, you could feel the presence of the refugees and the people who were being rescued. But as you sit here and you go in the pilot house and you look around the engine room, there's also the presence of the 4-man crew, of Henny Sindig. These are people who should never be forgotten. And it's a great honor to preserve this vessel, to preserve their stories.
Over the past 200 years, ships have rescued thousands of people. Although not all succeeded in their task, each has left a legacy that inspires future generations to similar acts of selfless bravery.